Okay.
Okay. We had covered basically chapters 3, 4, and 5, just sort of in a rapid fashion, you might say, last time. And I want to just go back and touch a couple of things through those chapters, kind of by way of refreshing our memories and setting the stage for what we'll look at tonight. Beginning in chapter 3, we talked about the rebuilding of the temple. And there's an interesting point to be made about this. You know, we talked last week about the fact that the temple that they rebuilt, or the pattern that they followed Solomon's temple. So the exiles temple, or the temple of Zerubbabel, what stood from the time of the return until the days of Herod the Great, when he started enlarging and beautifying it, and took most of 70 years actually. In Jesus' day, they said 46 years this has been in construction, and you would tear it down and rebuild it in 3 days. They didn't understand what he was talking about. But we talked a little bit last week about the fact that when they rebuilt the temple, Ezekiel had seen his vision of the temple in the last chapters of the book of Ezekiel. And it's often noted that the dimensions and the description there don't match anything that was ever built in Jerusalem. They don't match Solomon's temple. They don't match Zerubbabel's temple, and they don't match Herod's temple, which is Zerubbabel's temple on steroids, basically. There's a reason for that. So they go back and they build the temple. They lay the foundation. Of course, there's that long period of about 15 years where they don't get anything done, closer to 20 really. But if you flip over to chapter 6 and look at verse 3, there is an explanation for why they did not follow Ezekiel's dimensions. Now, aside from the fact that Ezekiel's dimensions pertain to a spiritual temple, church, aside from that fact, there is a reason that they would not look at that and say, okay, we ought to rebuild on this pattern. If you look at chapter 6 and verse 3, in the instruction that Cyrus gives, there is a very specific statement concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where sacrifices were offered, and let its foundations be retained. Its height shall be 60 cubits, its breadth 60 cubits, with 3 layers of great stones and 1 layer of timber. So we go back here to chapter 3, where they start the construction. They lay the foundation, they start the construction. Of course, it's going to stop. Why did they not follow Ezekiel's dimensions? After all, he's got a newer plan, so to speak, than Moses had been given. Well, number one, Ezekiel's plan was for a different temple. He's looking forward to the days of the church. Number two, when Cyrus gives the authorization to rebuild the temple, he specified you build it back just like it was, basically. So that limits them to the footprint and the dimensions of Solomon's temple. Well, this begins in the fall, in September, the 7th month. And notice the statement in chapter 3, everything is to be done as it is written in the law, as it's written in the law of Moses. Now, they had gone into captivity because they ignored the law. Now that they're coming out of captivity, now that they've seen the promise that God had made through Ezekiel and through Jeremiah and through Daniel, now that they're seeing his promise fulfilled, what are they going to do? They're going to be very careful to try to do everything right. The law here refers to the Torah, and that's specifically the writings of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. So the first thing they do, they go out and they built the altar of God, of the God of Israel, to offer burnt offerings on it. And that altar, that word is Mizbeach, and it's the slaughter place for either food or sacrifices. It says they built it, restored it, set it on its bases. They put it on the original site, on the original base or foundation for the altar, even before laying the foundation of the temple. They're going to start with sacrifices. And so the first thing they do, like we discussed last week, is that they observe the Feast of Tabernacles or booths. And that's one of the 3 feasts authorized in the law of Moses. And that's the one in the fall. Now, this is a commandment. This is a requirement of them. Notice you get down here to verse 5, and it tells us that they're going to observe all of the feasts after the regular burnt offerings, offerings at new moon, all the appointed feasts of the Lord, the offerings of everyone who made a free will offering to the Lord. Now, the appointed feasts, that means they reinstituted all of the prescribed holidays and offerings, free will offerings, and the monthly offerings, the new moon sacrifices, and so forth. That also means that they began with tabernacles because that's the time of year they were there, but they're also going to keep the Passover. They're going to observe Pentecost. It does not say anything about Purim at this point, and the reason it does not is because Purim has not yet begun. Purim is not going to be instituted for another, roughly 60 to 70 years until the days of Esther. And at that, Purim will begin to be added in as a celebration, as a feast, a holiday, along with those that are authorized by the Lord. So we see the foundation of the temple, the new temple being laid in verses 8 through 13. The Levites are appointed over the work from age 20 and up. And this takes place about the year 535 BC. And there's both great joy and great sorrow. Joy that they're doing what they ought to be doing. We get into chapter 4, and what do we find? Adversaries begin to hinder the work. Opposition develops. And probably the opposition are the Samaritans, like we talked about last week in verse 2. Opposition from those who are basically those who are only partly godly. They're only partly committed to the Lord. The Samaritans observed the law of Moses enough to get God off their backs, so to speak, but they did not give up their idolatry altogether. Now you flip over to Revelation chapter 3 to the letters to the 7 churches, and in verse 9 and verses 15 through 22, one of the things you find Jesus taking issue with some of the brethren there, some of the Christians there, is they're not fully committed to God. You look down here in chapter 4, though, purity is required in those who are working on the temple, required in the laborers. Verse 3, in verses 4 and 5, you encounter hired resistance. They get a lobbyist. Let's go to court. Let's stop this. And what happens? The Jews begin to become discouraged. We talked about the letter writing that takes place in chapter 4, those who are doing the writing and the letter that itself, the false accusations that are made against them, that they're going to be rebellious, they're going to turn against the Medo-Persian rulers, that they won't pay their taxes, they won't offer tribute, they won't pay their custom, which would be a portion of their crops. And so the statement is made in verse 14 by those who are accusing the Jews, we eat the salt of the palace, and it's not fitting for us to witness the king's dishonor. Therefore, we send and inform the king. We have support, financial support. We have military protection. Really, all this amounts to is a statement by the opposition saying, we're the loyal subjects of the crown, and these people are a bunch of rebels. Of course, that's not entirely true. Their focus, They might have considered themselves, the opposition might have considered themselves loyal subjects, but their object was not any issue of loyalty to the Medo-Persians. It was to stop these people that they considered their enemies. And so the order comes back, stop the rebuilding, stop the construction, and it stops. You look down here at chapter 4 and verse 23, you have what appears to be a victory for the forces of evil. And what do? They hurry to enforce it. They hurry to enforce it. Now, it's, I can't remember the man's name off the top of my head, but he's a Catholic priest, if memory serves me, who has made the observation in our day that evil preaches tolerance until it becomes dominant. And then it seeks to stamp out all opposition. And that's not an exact quote, but that's the gist of it. Well, that's what's going on here. The forces of evil, the unrighteous people, feel they've got the upper hand, and so they're going to miss no opportunity to try to stamp out everything that they oppose. And so the restoration stops. The work stops, but only at the point of arms, only because the king has ordered it. You get into chapter 5, and there's a time change, a time difference. We're years later, about 15, 18 years later, and Haggai and Zechariah have appeared, and they stir up Zerubbabel, the prince, and the children of Judah to get back to work. This is the overruling direction from the Lord. In other words, you need to be paying more attention to God than you do to the opposition. Opposition is still coming from the palace. Now, we talked a little bit last week about Tattenai, and Tattenai is the governor of the province beyond the river, which would seem to be that area to the north of Judah and basically surrounding Judah, all that area over toward the Mediterranean Sea. But Tattenai is not the same guy who had stopped the work, who had written the original letter to stop the work, or at least not as far as we can tell. He doesn't seem to have a dog in this fight, as it were. And so he questions them about this and writes a letter. And it appears to be an honest letter, a letter to King Darius, a new king. Now, the kings of the Medo-Persian Empire. We start with Cyrus the Great, who became king of the Medes and the Persians, first the Medes, then the Persians, in 550 BC. You probably can't read the board because it's small, but maybe you can zoom in on it on the recording if you want to look at this. But Cyrus the Great, in the days of Zerubbabel, is the one who frees the Jews and all of Israel, if they want to go, to return to Jerusalem and begin to rebuild the temple. That's the era of Zerubbabel. That's the first great migration, 50,000 that return. And he rules until 530 BC. He dies and is replaced by his son, Cambyses II, who is also mentioned here, and not by that name. And Cambyses reigns for only 8 years, from 530 to 522. And he doesn't really figure into this record in any direct way. Now, Cambyses is going to be followed by a son whose name is Bardia. But Bardia is promptly deposed, removed by his brother, Darius the First. Bardia reigned for only a few months in the year 522, and Darius the First. Now, this is the guy we're dealing with here in chapter 6, Darius the First, and he's going to reign from 522 all the way down to 486. So he's going to reign for almost 40 years, a good long time. And he is the one who is going to authorize them to continue the rebuilding. Now, Tattenai sends the letter. They're obeying a decree from Cyrus, according to verse 13. Jerusalem is supposed to be the city of peace, Jerusalem. And so this is supposed to be accomplished. So we come into chapter 5 and get to the end of the chapter. Therefore, if it seems good to the king, let search be made in the royal archives there in Babylon to see whether a decree was issued by Cyrus for the king, Cyrus the king, for the rebuilding of this house of God in Jerusalem, and let the king send his pleasure in this matter. So that's the governor's request. They claim that they were authorized to do this. Is there any record of this? Well, chapter 6 tells us, yes, there is. And that's where we pick up really tonight. Now, one of the things to notice about the Medo-Persian Empire, and again, you probably can't see it clearly because I don't have a good dark marker, unfortunately, and there's glare and so forth. But the Medo-Persian Empire actually had 3 capital cities. Remember that in the days of Daniel, it was Cyrus who had overthrown Belshazzar, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar was the ruler in Babylon, and they had conquered Babylon without a fight, invaded it overnight, and deposed and executed Belshazzar and just replaced him. They left everything else. They left the Babylonian bureaucracy. That would be Daniel and the people that worked for him and with him. They left all of them in place. It was basically a bloodless transfer of power. And what had been the mighty Babylonian Empire now is consumed from within by one of their client states, the Medo-Persians. Well, the Medo-Persians take possession of Babylon, but the Medes and the Persians were 2 separate people who had allied themselves with each other and intermarried and so forth. They were a coalition empire. So you have the capital of the Medes and the capital of the Persians. They conquer Babylon, and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the wonders of the ancient world and so forth, a beautiful city. So they have no reason to destroy it. They've captured it without a fight. So they're going to continue to use it. It is an ancient capital anyway. They're going to continue to use it as a royal city. But in the meantime, the Persians have their capital at Shushan or Susa. And there is a very rough map over here on the right side of the board. This is the Mediterranean Sea. This is the Indian Ocean. You've got the Persian Gulf right here. You've got the Red Sea right here, Egypt, Arabia, and right here along the Mediterranean coast is what had been Israel. Jerusalem is here. I didn't bother to draw in the rivers and everything. But over here across the Fertile Crescent at the head, and this is not to scale, by the way. I am not a cartographer or an artist. But at the head of the Persian Gulf, situated along the Euphrates River, you have Babylon. East and a little bit north of there, you have the capital of the Persian Empire, Shushan. And then almost directly north, you have the capital of the Medes, which is Ecbatana, or if you're reading from the King James Version, it's called Acmetha. So we have 3 different capital cities or royal cities in the Medo-Persian Empire. So Cyrus had given the decree almost immediately after conquering Babylon. So the request is search the archives in Babylon. That's where the record would be. So we come into chapter 6. Darius the king made a search, made a decree. A search was made in Babylonia in the house of the archives where the documents were stored. And lo and behold, what do we discover? Look at verse 2. The records had been moved. They were not in Babylon at all. They were hundreds of miles away in Acmetha or Ecbatana, the capital of the Medes. So the records had been moved, but they were found. A scroll was found on which this was written, a record in the first year of Cyrus the king. Cyrus the king issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where sacrifices were offered. Let its foundations be retained. Its height shall be 60 cubits, its breadth 60 cubits, 3 layers of great stones, 1 layer of timber. Let the cost be paid from the royal treasury. Now, the dimensions are not quite the same. You go over to 1 Kings chapter 6 at verse 2, and what do you find about the dimensions of Solomon's temple? Well, it's 60 cubits long, which would be about 90 feet long. That allows it to be divided into thirds so that the holy place is about 60 feet long, and the most holy, or the Holy of Holies, is about 30 feet long. Well, how wide is it? It's 20 cubits wide. That would equal about 30 feet. So we know that the Holy of Holies is a square room. The most holy place is a square room about 30 feet by 30 feet. And the holy place, or the outer part, is about 30 by 60. And it's 30 cubits tall. So it's about 4.5 stories tall, about 45 feet. That's Solomon's temple. Look at the dimensions here. The length is not stated, but the width, or the breadth of it, is 60 cubits, about 90 feet. Now that may well be, it may well be that that corresponds to the original length of it. And it's the width that's not stated here. But the phraseology here, its height shall be 60 cubits and its width, or its breadth, 60 cubits. It's going to be taller, but it's going to be built on the same foundation, basically. And those dimensions are thought by a lot of scholars and commentators basically to be the maximum allowable size. Don't make it any bigger than this. And if that's the case, it may well be that would be the maximum allowable, so that it's not any bigger or any grander than any of the idol temples in Shushan or Babylon or in Akhmetha. That's purely speculation, but that may be part of it as well. Now, you find the same details for Solomon's temple over in 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 36. But notice the statement here at the end of verse 3. The cost is to be, verse 4, the cost is to be funded by the Persians, at least in part. But notice now, as you come down to verse 5 in chapter 6, Darius explains what's being done here. Cyrus had made the decree. Now, Cyrus has been dead for some years at this point. But let also the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple that is in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, be restored and brought back to the temple that is in Jerusalem, each to its place. You shall put them in the house of God. Darius gives his own decree. Build that temple. Starting at verse 6 down to verse 12, his decree is, here's what you do. Tatanai, I'm giving you an instruction. Well, Darius searched. He found the record. And he did not say, well, Cyrus is dead and gone, so that doesn't count anymore. Because unlike previous empires, there is a peculiar feature in the laws of the Medes and the Persians. Go back to chapter 1 and look at verses 7 through 11. And in chapter 1, you have the gist of Cyrus's instructions. Here's what his decree said. Do this, do this, do this, give this much, this amount, and so forth. If you flip over to Esther chapter 1 and look at verse 19, and then flip a couple of pages to Esther chapter 8 and look at verse 8, you begin to see something about Medo-Persian law. Daniel confirms what Esther shows us long before Esther ever came along in Daniel chapter 6 in verses 8 and 12 and 15. And the peculiarity of Medo-Persian law is this: once a Medo-Persian ruler seals the law, puts his signet ring to it and authorizes it, it cannot be repealed. It cannot be set aside. If you remember in the book of Esther, Haman secured the king's authorization to execute all the Jews. And when Esther interceded and Haman is taken out of the way, they still have a problem. There is still an order with the king's seal on it. Now, never mind that it was Haman that put the king's seal there. The king had given him that authority. So it carries the weight of the king's command. There is still an order on this day in all the provinces: kill all the Jews. We can't just repeal that law. So how do they deal with it? We'll just pass another law that says the Jews can defend themselves. And they did. Well, here, Darius has to contend with the fact that Cyrus had made a decree and set his seal to it. So it is law and it must be done. Build that temple. So now the instructions that he gives to Tattenai, to the governor, are interesting. And the first thing he says basically is, Tattenai and Shetharboznai and all of your associates, all of your co-workers, y'all keep your distance. You stay away from Jerusalem. Leave those people alone. Now, that would be a very unwelcome instruction in the days of Zerubbabel, in the early days, because it was those who had opposed the work who'd gotten that stoppage. But now they're being expressly told, you leave the Jews alone. Stay away and leave them alone. In verse 7, he says, let the work of this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. You let them do their thing. And you take tax money and support it. I make a decree regarding what you shall do for the elders of the Jews for the rebuilding of this house of God. The cost is to be paid to these men in full and without delay from the royal revenue. And here's what you give them: whatever is needed, verse 9, bulls, rams, sheep for burnt offerings, wheat, salt, wine, oil, whatever the priests at Jerusalem require. Now it's interesting, the list of things that he gives here parallels what God had specified in Leviticus chapter 1 and chapter 2. You've got the same list of supplies, Leviticus 1 verses 5 and 10 and Leviticus 2 verse 1. So whatever they need for burnt offerings, that which ascends to the Lord, the priest on the altar and the smoke going up to God, whatever they need, you supply. Make sure they have what they need. But look at verse 10. In verse 10, he gives an explanation. You give them out of the royal treasury, out of the revenue of the government, whatever they need, so that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and do what? Pray for the life of the king and his sons. So he wants them to reestablish proper religion, and he is implicitly commanding these Jews to pray for him and pray for his sons. Now, his sons, that could be the fruit of his body, his offspring. But that could also, good evening, Brother Roger, it's good to see you. That could also be a reference to the total government. Sons, in this context of the Old Testament, sometimes does not refer necessarily to your actual offspring, but to all of those underneath you. That would be his governors and his servants and his advisors and so forth. And in that context, that instruction on Darius's part coordinates with what Jeremiah had told the folks going into exile in Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 7. What was the instruction there? Pray for the peace and prosperity of the city wherever God locates you. When you go into captivity, instead of fighting against God's will, pray for the welfare of that city. Think about Paul's words to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. I will therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands before the Lord. Now, that's not a prescription of posture, that's a figure of speech. But notice in verse 2 of 1 Timothy chapter 2, who we Christians are authorized, commanded to pray for kings and those in authority, those who are over us in the civil realm. But then he gives, and this would almost be funny if it weren't serious. Now you get to chapter 6 and verse 11, and Darius kind of gives a little addendum. He tacks on a little something. He's not altering, or he's not that's not the right word. He's not contravening Cyrus's decree in any way, but he's going to add a little bit of his own in verse 11, an addendum, if you will, to his instructions and to Cyrus's original decree. Basically, anybody who confounds this command, anybody who hinders this in any way, pull a beam out of his house and impale him on it and turn his house into a dunghill or into a public latrine, basically, a public toilet. That's pretty blunt. Anybody that gets in the way, anybody that hinders this, kill him and turn his property into a public toilet. I think he wanted it to go forward. So, before he's done, look at verse 12. Darius is going to invoke a curse from the Lord on anyone who dares to interfere. May the God who has caused his name to dwell there overthrow any king or people who shall put out a hand to alter this or to destroy the house of God that is in Jerusalem. I, Darius, make a decree, let it be done with all diligence. So, how much of a believer is Darius? Well, historically, he would have given very, very similar instructions for the rebuilding of any temple to any god for any captive people that he released. So this ought not be read as a conversion endorsement by Darius. But his objective was to bring in the goodwill of as many different gods of the people he ruled over as he possibly could. That sets him apart from the Babylonians and the Assyrians before them and the Syrians before them and so forth. They always seemingly tried to stamp out the religion of the people that they conquered. We see that in Nebuchadnezzar's efforts to Babylonianize Daniel and his friends. and the uncertainty, the fearfulness that the eunuchs that administered to them in the beginning of their captivity had over them not eating the king's dainties and so forth. But the Medo-Persians have a much more, I'd hesitate to say enlightened, but a much more liberal perspective on such things. And so their perspective is, hey, the more gods, the more deities that we've got on our side that are kindly disposed to us, the better off we'll be, the more secure we'll be. And so when it comes to the Jews, they don't have an idol, but they had a temple. Rebuild that temple and make sure that in your sacrificing, you pray for me and you make sacrifices for me and for my family and for the success of my kingdom. And so what do we find? Ezra 6, verses 13 through 18. Back to work we go, according to the word sent out by Darius the king, Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river, and Shethar-boznai and their associates did with all diligence what Darius had ordered. So they hand over the funds and they get out of the way. And notice what happens. They say, yes, sir, right now, and get to work. And they get out of the way. And now Haggai and Zechariah come back into the picture here. And notice what it says at verse 14. The elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. They finished their building by decree of the God of Israel and by decree of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. So the two helping prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, are mentioned. And it's interesting. Notice what it says. They prospered. Finally they prospered because they're doing what God commanded. All these intervening years, 15, 18, 20 years, they've allowed opposition to stymie them. Seemingly, they have made no effort that we know of, at any rate, to try to change or correct that. But now they're prospering because they're doing what God commanded. Over in Malachi chapter 3, their descendants in another 100 years or so are going to be taken to task by Malachi, because even though they're in the land of promise, even though they have been restored, even though they have the temple, even though the priesthood is back to doing its job, even though everything on the surface is just like it should be, what has happened in that intervening 100 years, the hearts of the people have gotten cold again. Now, they haven't gone off into idolatry. They've just gotten very self-centered and materialistic in Malachi's day. And so in chapter 3, Malachi begins to challenge them with the things they've done that have offended God. And one of the challenges in chapter 3 and verse 10 is bring the whole tithe into the storehouse and see if I don't open up the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing on you so great that you cannot contain it. Now, again and again in Malachi's day, Malachi makes these challenges and they say, well, how have we offended God? How have we done wrong? Show us. And they're very brazen about it. But time after time, Malachi illustrates exactly what was wrong. Now, when we do what God wants, what God instructs, when we follow his word, we prosper. In James chapter 4, in verse 1, James, writing to Christians, asks them about a problem going on in the church. Why are there wars and fighting? Why is there strife among saints? Because your priorities are messed up. You look at verse 2 in James chapter 4, and he says, you pray, you ask God to bless you so that you can misuse his blessings. You don't ask God to bless you so that you can glorify him. You ask God to bless you so that you can satisfy yourself, so that you can misuse his blessings for your own purposes. Same situation at its root that Malachi had dealt with. The same situation that had prevailed in the days of Zerubbabel from the time that opposition popped up until Haggai and Zechariah come on the scene and relight the fire. So they get to work, they finish the temple, and the house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. Well, that would correspond to about the year 516 BC. So it's about 20 years from the time of Cyrus's decree until the project is actually completed. And that would be in the spring of the year, late February into March, depending on the phase of the moon in that particular year, and leading up to what at that time of year? Well, that would be leading up to Passover, and then shortly after that, Pentecost. So you look at verses 16, 17, and 18, and what do we see? Worship in the temple finally is restored. Now, bear in mind that long before 586, worship in the temple had not been what it should be. Long before the temple was destroyed, it had been made a place of mockery. It had been made a place of idolatry by some kings and rulers and priests. Proper worship had been ignored. At one point, the book of the law is out of sight, out of mind. In the days of Josiah, Hilkiah the priest comes and says, what? We found it. How could God's law have been lost? Except that they weren't practicing it. They weren't paying attention to it. But now they've come back. It was disobedience and lack of faith that had sent them into exile. Those who have come back now are very focused on trying to do everything right, to reestablish the law of Moses according to the pattern, verse 18, as it is written in the law of Moses, in the book of Moses. They offered at the dedication of this house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs. Well, that's a pittance compared to what Solomon had offered hundreds of years before, but that's a lot nevertheless. And it's a time of celebration and rejoicing. And so they set the priests in their divisions, the Levites in their divisions for the service of God at Jerusalem. Now, there are a couple of things to take note of here. This is the restoration, the restarting of temple worship. And with the exception of the little window in the days of the Maccabees when Antiochus defiles the temple and worship comes to a screeching halt for a couple of years, things are going to continue pretty consistently right down until the days of Christ and the apostles, right down to 70 AD. But there's something else here that we're going to see in just a moment that we need to think about. Now, we mentioned in the introduction that the book of Ezra is a bilingual book. It's written partly in Aramaic, which is Hebrew language, Chaldean writing. It would be a cognate language. The Aramaic portion ends here in chapter 6. From verse 19 on in the ancient manuscripts, everything else is written in Hebrew. And that makes sense because this corresponds to things that are of particular importance to the Hebrew people, to the Jews, and not of such importance really to the Medo-Persians. But in chapter 6, as we come to verse 19, verses 19, 20, 21, 22, what takes place? They finish the temple late February into March, in the spring, right at the basically at the end of the calendar year for the Jews, the beginning of a new year. So where do they go from here? On the 14th day of the first month, the returned exiles did what? They kept the Passover. But notice what's not mentioned here. Now, the focus throughout Ezra and Nehemiah, the focus is on the Jews in Judah, the Jews in Jerusalem. It's not on all of the Jews scattered throughout the ancient world. But the point is made, it's these Jews in Jerusalem who keep the Passover, the exiles or the returnees. Nothing is said of the other Jews out in the Gentile world and the folks that they left back in Babylon and Persia and so forth. Nothing is said about those Jews observing the Passover. Did they or did they not? Don't know. For what it's worth, Passover was not an observance that required the temple. Now, when God sends the children of Judah into captivity, what's one of the things that Jeremiah tells them? You're going into 70 years of captivity until the land has done what?
Sabbath.
Until the land has kept its Sabbath years. They were supposed to let the land lie fallow every 7th year, and that was a Sabbath year. They were supposed to let the land lie fallow 2 years in a row every 49 years. That was a Jubilee year, and all the land titles were supposed to be returned to original families and heirs and so forth. There's no biblical record that they ever actually did that. But they go into captivity 70 years until the land has fulfilled its Sabbaths, until the land has had its fallow time. During that time of captivity, there is no biblical record of the Jews observing the Passover, Pentecost, or the Feast of Tabernacles. None of those holy days required the existence of a temple. It is possible, and I have not scoured ancient historians, at least not yet, to try to find out. It certainly is conceivable that there may have been faithful, observant Jews among the captives who did keep the Passover, observe Pentecost, observe the Feast of Booths and so forth, but there's no biblical record of it. And there's no mention of those Jews out in the Gentile world doing this. Now, that may simply be because all the focus is right here in Jerusalem. But if you remember in our introductory classes, one of the things that we focused on is that the restoration under Cyrus marks the beginning of a kind of division in Judaism and in Jewish culture, because the folks who return, who are going to be the progenitors of the people that become the Sanhedrin, the ruling council, the Pharisees and the Sadducees with whom Jesus would contend in the first century, these folks in Judah, they're very focused on observing the law, on doing things right. But what about the Jews elsewhere? There is a somewhat different culture of Judaism in the Gentile world. It's not less religious. but it's much more oriented toward getting along with the non-Jewish neighbors in some respects. You think about the Apostle Paul, Saul of Tarsus, before he became the Apostle Paul. Where was Saul from?
Tarsus.
Tarsus in Cilicia,
In modern day Italy,
which is
modern day Turkey.
Turkey, Asia Minor. Saul, breathing out threatenings and slaughter, seeking letters from the high priest, thinking to do all manner of evil against the saints. A Hebrew of Hebrews, a Pharisee of Pharisees. Saul was not a Jerusalem Jew. Saul was not even a Judah Jew. Saul was one of those Gentile world Jews who had come or been perhaps sent by his family to study under Gamaliel, and would have been treated by the home folks as kind of a second-class Jew. Think about what happens in the church in Acts chapter 6 in the first half dozen verses. Now, these are all Christians in Acts chapter 6, but what's their ethnic and religious and cultural and experiential background? They're all Jews. Where are they from? Well, you go back to Acts chapter 2, you've got Jews from Judea and Jerusalem, but you've also got Jews from Cappadocia and Pontus and Galatia and basically everywhere under the sun. And so we get to Acts chapter 6, some of these folks that had made the pilgrimage to come for the day of Pentecost, the feast of Pentecost, had been converted. They had not gone home. And so in the ministration to those who are in need, what happens? Some of the Judea, Jerusalem Jews maintain that pecking order of the Jewish culture, where if you are a Jew, you're better than any Gentile in the world, regardless of where you are. But if you're a Judea Jew, you're better than any Jew elsewhere in the world. And if you're a Jerusalem Jew, you're better than any Judea Jew. And so they neglect those who are not from around here in favor of those who are. Well, how does that bear on Saul of Tarsus? Saul is one of those guys, you ain't from around here, are you? He's got something to prove as a Jew. What does he say about himself? I was more zealous than everybody else. Well, where does that come from? Some of that goes back to this point in time, where there is a cultural divide within Judaism between the Judean Jews and the society and the culture that they're building, and the non-Judean or the Gentile world Jews and the society and the culture in which they live, which is very different. Well, they keep the Passover here. They offer all of these sacrifices. They slaughtered the Passover lamb. The priests and the Levites purified themselves. All of them were clean. That implies that they have accomplished something that had not taken place. It may also suggest that some of the people are still not clean, in a sense, still not purified. They slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the returned exiles, for their fellow priests, and for themselves. It's eaten by everyone. Everybody participates. Everyone who had separated himself from the uncleanness of the people of the land. Now that's a significant statement because it portends what we're going to bump into at the end of the book of Ezra, as well as in the book of Nehemiah. What are we going to find when Ezra actually comes on the scene in chapter 7? What is Ezra going to discover among some of these people? What is Nehemiah going to have to contend with decades later in his day? Some of these Jews, even though they're among the group that are supposedly very focused on doing everything according to the law, doing everything just right, some of them, their power of concentration must have been about gnat-sized, because they end up intermarrying with the Samaritans, the neighbors, the folks of Ashdod, and so forth. And in doing that, they defile themselves, and they're not able to participate in this. All those who had separated themselves from the uncleanness of the people of the land. Well, that implies that some of them had not and could not participate. And that, of course, that sows some seed for the future of Judeism. Now, let's just jump forward in history momentarily. Roughly 150 years, from 516 down to about 380 BC. What's going on around 380 down to about 350? Well, the Jews are in the land. For the first time in generations, there is no prophet from God. Malachi has done his thing. He has spoken his piece for God, and he's either a very old man or he's disappeared. And in the larger world, the Medo-Persians are still the dominant empire, but there's competition on the horizon. Over in the west, there's a guy named Philip from the mountains of northern Greece. And it's his dream to unite all of Greece under one ruler. And he's going to make some pretty significant steps in that direction, but he's going to leave that to his son, Alexander, who, as little more than a boy, tutored by Socrates, Alexander is going to embark on a campaign to conquer the whole world and bring the virtues, benefits, and blessings of Greek culture and polity and philosophy to the whole world. It's during Alexander's time that neighborhoods, as it were, in the vicinity of Judea become very, we might almost say, infected. And some of the Jews become infected with this Greek philosophy. The roots of the region that we call the Decapolis, that area to the east of the Jordan River and just north of the Dead Sea, running up along the Jordan River from the Dead Sea up above the Sea of Galilee. The Decapolis, the region of 10 cities, though there were actually more than 10, that were established by Alexander, built on the Greek model and intended to spread Greek thinking in that area. That's when these places and that influence comes into being. And that's how it is then that there is a strong non-Judean Jewish influence in that area in the days of Jesus and the apostles. Well, come back here to chapter 7 or chapter 6, and they keep the Passover, then they keep the feast. It says we have the They keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread 7 days with joy, great joy in all of this. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, matzo, that which is sweet, which is not fermented. It's not risen in any way. They celebrate that the house of the Lord has been completed, basically. Well, that's a good place for us to stop and take about a 10 or 12-minute break. Questions or comments before we do? We'll break there and resume shortly. Start it again. All right, there is a time element between the end of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7 that equates to some roughly 70 or so years. Ezra is not contemporary, or at least not by very much if he is, with Zerubbabel. He comes along quite a bit later. This is in the reign of Artaxerxes, the king of Persia. Now, I mentioned to Rosalind, you probably can't see it too well on the board because the markers were very light, but the chronology of the kings of the Medo-Persian Empire: Cyrus the Great, 550 to 530, followed by Cambyses, who's not really mentioned, certainly not by that name in the scriptures other than just in passing, 530 to 522. Bardia did not survive but just a few months in 522 and was replaced by Darius the First, who now reigns for 36 years from 522 to 486. And it's during this first time period that we deal with Zerubbabel and Haggai and Zechariah. We get down here to Darius. The temple is completed, and that's the time frame of Haggai and Zechariah in their prophetic work. Darius is followed by Xerxes the First, who reigns about 20 years from 485 down to 465 approximately. And it is commonly thought that this is the Ahasuerus of the book of Esther. Now there's some debate because Xerxes the First is followed by Artaxerxes the First, who reigns from 465 to 424. And there are some who would contend that Artaxerxes the First is Esther's husband. We'll discuss that a little more when we get to the book of Esther, but the particulars of the reign of Xerxes seem to fit better than his successor Artaxerxes. So this would be during the time frame of Ezra. There is no mention of Ezra in this role in the book of Esther, but this is a later time period. This is the section of the book that's written in Hebrew. After this, in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra, the son of Sariah, and now we have Ezra's lineage. He is, turns out, a priest of the lineage of Aaron, descended from Aaron through Eleazar and Phinehas and Abishua and so forth. He is also a scribe, and that word literally means a scratcher. One who scratches or scrapes. In other words, he writes, he's a secretary. He is a literate man. And he goes from Babylon to Jerusalem. This Ezra went up from Babylon, a scribe skilled in the law of Moses that the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. The king granted him all that he asked, for the hand of the Lord his God was upon him. What was it that prompted Ezra to ask for this trip? Well, we're not told at this point. There went up also to Jerusalem in the 7th year of Artaxerxes some of the people of Israel, some of the priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, and temple servants. Well, how could they be temple servants if they're over in captivity still? This may be a reference to their lineage, to who they had been, who their ancestors had been. It could well be that they are selected from among the Jews to go and fill these roles. It's not stated specifically, but we're proposing a 4-month trip here, basically. 7th year of Artaxerxes, and Ezra comes to Jerusalem in the 5th month, the 7th year of the king. So it takes about 4 months for them to get there. How many are there? We're not told at this point, but Ezra is not traveling alone. He's got a retinue, a group of people with him. And so this is a slow journey. But notice what it says about him. Ezra came to Jerusalem in the 5th month. On the 1st day of the 1st month, he began to go up from Babylon. On the 1st day of the 5th month, he came to Jerusalem, for the good hand of his God was on him. And here's why. Ezra 7 and verse 10. He had prepared his heart. That's a good place to begin. Many people experience a change of heart when exposed to the gospel of Christ. And that's as far as it goes. Prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord, to do it and to teach it. Seek the law, practice the law, teach the law. That's an interesting word, teach. It's lamad, the Talmud, and it means literally to beat with a rod, to chastise. Think of the image of a Catholic nun whacking a student's knuckles with a ruler. That's almost the imagery here, to train. Now, this statement in chapter 7, verse 10, to seek the law of the Lord, to do it, to teach in Israel, that's the complete picture. That's the image of 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2 in practice. Teach faithful men to teach faithful men. But what does Jesus say to the rulers of the Jews, or about the rulers of the Jews in Matthew 23 and verse 2? Speaking to the crowd, he says, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. They're the authorities in the law. Whatever they tell you about the law, do. But then what does he go on and say? Don't
Follow their deeds.
follow their example. Don't follow their deeds, because they say and do not. So they sought the law of the Lord, they taught the law of the Lord, but they didn't practice the law of the Lord. And that made them hypocrites. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, you hypocrites! You bind great burdens on men, grievous to be borne, and will not so much as lift a little finger to help them bear those burdens. Likewise, in Romans chapter 2, verse 21, and James chapter 3 and verse 1, the warning to Christians about being teachers. James says, do not be many of you teachers, my brethren, knowing that we shall receive the heavier judgment. That is, there is a responsibility that goes with teaching. Now, in chapter 7, these first 10 verses, we have the presentation of Ezra. Finally, the man whose name the book bears makes his appearance. And at verse 11, from verse 11 down to verse 26, you have the text, really, of the letter authorizing Ezra to return. Dear Ezra, basically, from the king. This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave to Ezra the priest, the scribe, a man learned in matters of the commandments of the Lord and his statutes for Israel. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven, peace. Now I make a decree that any one of the people of Israel or their priests or Levites in my kingdom who freely offers to go to Jerusalem may go with you. For you are sent by the king and his 7 counselors to make inquiries about Judah and Jerusalem according to the law of your God, which is in your hand, and also to carry the silver and the gold that the king and his counselors have freely offered to the God of Israel, whose dwelling is at Jerusalem, with all the silver and gold that you shall find in the whole province of Babylonia, and with the free will offerings of the people and priests, vowed willingly for the house of their God that is at Jerusalem. Okay, so we've got a priest descended from Aaron, qualified to be a high priest, a scribe by trade, learned, scholarly. Now, pause here and think about, what do the scribes scribe at this point in history? What's their job? A literate man in the ancient world was a rare and precious commodity in any ancient culture, because at this point in history, most people were not literate, including kings and rulers for the most part. Among the ancient peoples, the Jews were an anomaly because they were largely literate people. Even tradesmen, even farmers among the Jews would generally be able to read and to write to some degree. And the simple explanation for that is their God had given them a written law, and they needed to be able to read and understand it. And so education, literacy was prized among them, where it was not necessarily a prized quality in the Gentile world at large. So here's a man with this ability. Well, what would be the focus of his work as a scribe? What would he scribe? Now, in public service, he might write letters, he might write communiques. Daniel certainly wrote for his kings as he served in the Babylonian bureaucracy, and undoubtedly wrote letters and authorizations and commandments as governor and satrap and so forth. But what would Ezra's writing focus on?
I guess would be the law, but I'm not sure.
There you go. Ezra's focus as a priest would undoubtedly be the law. Ezra is probably the prototype in this respect. Remember that it's Ezra who is traditionally credited by the Jews, not only with recording the book of Ezra, but also compiling the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the history of Judah from a priestly point of view. But Ezra also may very well serve as the prototype for the scribes of the intertestamental era, who, among other things, would produce the Septuagint, the translation from Hebrew to Greek of the Old Testament, and who would develop the methodology for reproducing the scriptures. It was this class of priests who began the work of duplicating the scriptures, page by page, by hand, counting the letters, knowing what letter starts on this line and what letter ends at the last line, and dividing them up so that everything came back exactly right. And if you ended on the wrong letter, that page would be thrown away because something was wrong with it. And so this would be the work, among other things, that Ezra had trained for. To seek the law of the Lord, to do it, and to teach it. And to teach it, you had to have copies of it, among other things. Now, Artaxerxes' authorization, only the folks that actually want to go should go back. He's not commanding anybody, but anybody that wants to is allowed. And will give help from the Persian treasury up to a limit, verses 21 to 24. Now, here in chapter 7, as we go along, all the help from the treasury, all the offerings that you can gather up in the province of Babylon, and that would limit the territory somewhat. That's not the whole empire, that's just the region around Babylon. But that still represents the area probably with the most numerous population of Jews at that point in history. And as we go along, whatever seems good to you and to your brothers to do with the rest of the silver and gold, you may do according to the will of your God, verse 18, or verse 19 rather. Verse 18. The vessels that have been given to you for the service of the house of your God, you shall deliver. So I thought that Cyrus had sent all the vessels back. Well, apparently there were more. The service of the house of your God, you deliver this, whatever else is required, whatever you need, the king's treasury will provide. And notice in verse 23, let there be no cause for wrath from your God, from the Lord God. Here is my decree to the governors, to the treasurers in the province beyond the river, whatever Ezra requires, up to 100 talents of silver, up to 100 cores of wheat, up to 100 baths of wine, up to 100 baths of oil, and salt without limit. Whatever he requires, let it be done in full. We don't want him, we don't want the God of Ezra against us. Notice what else he adds here. And this probably speaks to the territorial jockeying of the Medo-Persian bureaucracy. Remember in the days of Daniel, how that Daniel in the Babylonian bureaucracy, and then perhaps to a degree in the Medo-Persian as an old man, how many times does Daniel have to contend with others trying to get one up on him or knock him out of his position, take his place, and so forth? We've got to pass a law to entrap Daniel in his religion so we can get rid of him. Daniel is a faithful servant of his king as well as his God. But not all of the governors, not all of the bureaucrats are. And so they take steps to try to eliminate Daniel in his day. There's no reason for us to believe that there would not be the same kind of territorial jockeying, interdepartmental competition, you might say, in the Medo-Persian bureaucracy as well. There's always somebody, there's always a Haman trying to elevate themselves in the bureaucracy. Look at the American government today. How many different departments and heads and legislators and so forth constantly seek to get ahead, one step ahead of somebody else. As I was driving down from Tennessee today in traffic, I was amazed and irritated at the number of people who would just cut in front of me in order to get one car length ahead of the guy next to me. They weren't making progress to speak of, but hey, I may not be in front, but I'm ahead of you. Well, that's the attitude of the consummate bureaucrat. So here, whatever Ezra requires, you give him, and I will not tolerate, get down here to verse 24, I will not tolerate you trying to sabotage him for your own advancement. He says, we notify you that it shall not be lawful to impose tribute, custom, or toll on any one of the priests, Levites, singers, doorkeepers, temple servants, or any other servants of this house of God. So rulers and governors and bureaucrats, if you've got prejudices or problems or you object to the Jews, you keep it to yourself, because they're serving their God on my behalf. That's the gist of what the king's letter says. Now, you, Ezra, according to the wisdom of your God that's in your hand, you appoint magistrates and judges to judge all the people in the province beyond the river. Now, this is an interesting turn of events. In the province beyond the river, there's no taxes on the Levites, verse 24. And Ezra, I'm putting you in charge of the province beyond the river. That would seem to be a tall step up from what Zerubbabel ruled over in his day. Zerubbabel was responsible for Jerusalem and the immediate surrounding territory of Judah. Ezra, in Zerubbabel's day, Tattenai is the governor or the ruler of the province beyond the river. And Zerubbabel basically answers to him in matters pertaining to the Medo-Persian Empire. Ezra seems to be in Tattenai's position at this point, with his focus being on Jerusalem and Judah. And notice what he says down here at verse 26, whoever will not obey the law of your God and the law of the king, let judgment be strictly executed on him. Now it's interesting. In verse 23, whatever is decreed by the God of heaven, let it be done in full. In verse 26, whoever will not obey the law of the God of heaven, or the Medo-Persian law, strict judgment immediately, death or banishment or confiscation of his goods or imprisonment, whatever you think is appropriate, Ezra. I'm giving you authority to judge yourselves. Now, notice in verse 25, he gives him a responsibility that goes in conjunction with that. Judge all the people, such as know the laws of your God, and those who do not know them, you shall teach. So, you administer judgment. You're an authority on the laws of your God. You administer judgment. But you teach those who don't know it. You cause them to understand. It's interesting that Hebrew word yedah here is the root of our English word idea. Those who are ignorant don't leave in that condition. They're good soil for teaching unless they're willingly ignorant. Now, Hosea chapter 4 and verse 6, Hosea talks about those who are what? They refuse to have God in their knowledge. They want to be ignorant of God. And we certainly have our share of those folks in our day, don't we? People who just don't want to know about God. But even in this circumstance, you have legal authority, Ezra, up to and including the death penalty for those offenses that warrant it. Now, verses 27 and 28 leading into chapter 8 seem to be Ezra's response, not the words of the king. And there's an important principle here. Never forget to give thanks. Blessed be the Lord, the God of our fathers, who put such a thing as this into the heart of the king, to beautify the house of the Lord that's in Jerusalem, who extended to me his steadfast love before the king and his counselors and before all the king's mighty officers. I took courage, for the hand of the Lord my God was on me, and I gathered leading men from Israel to go up with me. One thing he doesn't tell us here is how many. We'll get down into chapter 8, and we can tally up a number of them. So we have several hundred of them. Ezra is not leading just a group of a dozen on a fact-finding tour or something like this. He's got a rather large group of individuals, and if they have wives and children and baggage and servants, it would certainly swell to several thousand. But it still is not the massive number as in Zerubbabel's time. Ezra, though, does not hesitate, doesn't seem to even stop to think. He acts, it would almost seem automatically, to give thanks to God. And that's not to say it was insincere, but rather as if to say he wouldn't even consider not thanking God in this circumstance. All praise goes to the Lord for this, for what the king has done. Now, why would the king do this?
Try to gain some more favor from Jehovah,
Well,
which he considers a regional king, a regional god.
God, okay. That would certainly be in character for the Medo-Persian rulers. They wanted to obtain favor of whatever deities they could. The more gods on your side, the stronger you are, that kind of thing. It's a political move.
Yeah.
But if this Artaxerxes is Xerxes the first and is the Ahasuerus of the book of Esther, now it gets a little more interesting because it may imply something about Esther's influence behind the scenes as well. Certainly, her husband, Ahasuerus, at the end of the story of Esther, is very kindly disposed toward her, and because of her and Mordecai, toward her God.
And maybe trying to not repay, but trying to save some of the Jews by sending back to their land,
Very
as opposed to them being,
very possibly. And it may be an acknowledgement of sorts of Mordecai's influence and utility. After all, where does Mordecai end up at the end of the book of Esther? Well, he's a prominent bureaucrat himself, in a manner of speaking. And his influence with the king is not small. That's all speculation on my part.
yeah.
So there may be nothing to that at all. But if Xerxes is our Ahasuerus and Esther, then the time frame is right for there to be some overlap between the era of Ezra and the events of Esther. Whether there is or not, we'll just have to wait and ask the Lord. Well, come into chapter 8 now, and here we have the record of Ezra's return. And the first thing we have are the genealogical records, a list of the returnees in verses 1 through 14. These are the heads of their fathers' houses. This is the genealogy of those who went up with me from Babylonia in the reign of Artaxerxes the king. Of the sons of Phinehas, Gershom. Of the sons of Ithamar, Daniel. Of the sons of David, Hattush, and so on and so on. We get down here, with him 200 men, with this one 300, with this one 50, 70, 218, 160, and so on and so forth. So by the time we get to the end of this, we have several hundred at least. And as I said, if we include wives, children, servants, bag and baggage, and so forth, certainly several thousand. They went up with me from Babylonia, from the court of Bel, or the gate of Bel. Now you pick up at verse 15, and from verse 15 down to verse 20, we have Levites. He looks around in verse 15. I gathered these men to the river that runs to Ahava. There we camped 3 days. I reviewed the people and the priests. None of the sons of Levi. No Levites. We got to do something about this. I sent for Eleazar, Ariel, Shemaiah, Elnathan, and a list of men, leading men for Joirib and Elnathan, who were men of insight, sent them to Iddo, the leading man at the place Casiphia, telling them to say to Iddo and his brothers and the temple servants at the place of Casiphia, namely, send us ministers for the house of our God. And by the good hand of our God, they brought us a man of discretion of the sons of Mali, the son of Levi, namely, Sherebiah and his sons and kinsmen. So they were about to undertake this journey. They didn't have everybody they needed. So they had to gather up some Levites. And notice in verses 18, 19, and 20, they got the cream of the crop. Excellent men. And they begin their journey not by moving, but with fasting and prayer in verses 21, 22, and 23. Notice the gist of the prayer here. I proclaimed a fast there at the river Ahava that we might humble ourselves before our God to seek from him a safe journey for ourselves, our children, and all our goods. Okay, we just had a question answered, didn't we? So we can count all these men. Guess what? They've got wives and children and bag and baggage with them. So I was ashamed to ask the king for a band of soldiers and horsemen to protect us against the enemy on our way, since we had told the king, the hand of our God is good on all who seek him, and the power of his wrath is against all who forsake him. So we fasted and implored our God for this, and he listened to our entreaty. A couple of interesting things here. Number one, they're traveling with a royal decree through the territory of the king. Why should they worry about enemies?
Anytime you go somewhere today, you worry, don't you?
Enemies in this context would not necessarily be enemies of the Jews, but simply ruffians, highwaymen, thieves, robbers, folks that would take advantage.
Yeah.
It is an area remote from Shushan, Ecbatana, and Babylon. It is an area historically populated by rough, violent people, kings of Moab and Ammon and so forth in ancient times. It is an area where a large group, a large caravan with women and children and animals and so forth could not move fast or circle the wagons quickly, so to speak. They could have asked for a military escort. But Ezra had bragged, should we say, that God takes care of his own people. And now he's ashamed to say, well, I want to be sure. I want to walk by sight, not by faith. So they fast and they pray and they walk by faith. Great lesson in launching out on faith in this example. And so we begin the journey here. We fasted, prayed, he listened to our entreaty. I set apart 12 of the leading priests, Sherebiah, Hashabiah, and 10 of their kinsmen. Boy, there's some names for grandchildren. Sherebiah and Hashabiah.
Why don't you volunteer that to your children?
Well, now I have had a preacher friend who used to try to persuade his children to name one son Maher-Shalal Hashbaz, and then challenge them to put that on an IRS form. He claimed, this particular preacher, until he had one, he claimed he was going to name his firstborn son Segub, but he didn't. Named him Joshua instead, which is
probably had to convince his wife, or his wife convinced him that wasn't going to happen.
I'm sure she had something to say about that. I think Joshua's probably a much better choice.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so we set the priests apart. I weighed out to them the silver, the gold, the vessels, the offering for the house of our God that the king and his counselors and lords and all Israel there present had offered. Notice what's here: 650 talents of silver, silver vessels worth 200 talents, 100 talents of gold, 20 bowls of gold worth 1,000 darics, 2 vessels of bright bronze, precious as gold. And I said to them, you are holy to the Lord. The vessels are holy. The silver, the gold are a free will offering to the Lord, the God of our fathers. Guard them and keep them until you weigh them before the chief priests and the Levites and the heads of the fathers' houses in Israel at Jerusalem, within the chambers of the house of the Lord. So they took the weight of the silver and the gold to bring them to Jerusalem, to the house of our God. So we have a total weight here that's not in ounces. One estimate puts this at perhaps as much as 30 tons altogether. The value would be millions of dollars. And the lesson to apply here is take care of what God entrusts you with. Now think about the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts in the New Testament, as he is gathering up a collection among Gentile churches for Christians at Jerusalem and in Judea who are in need. These Gentile Christians have never met their Jewish brethren. Their experience of Jews in their society would be that the Jews tend to keep themselves aloof and look down their noses at everybody else. And yet, what have they heard from this Jewish Christian preacher, Paul, about their Jewish Christian brethren? We are brethren. They are in need. You have the ability to do something about it. Gather it up and send it to them. And when the time comes, he says to them, you pick your own individuals to carry what you've gathered, and I'll go with them. Let them be responsible. He's not asking them, hand it off to me and I'll take care of it. He wants to keep everything above board. Now, these priests are selected by Ezra to have charge of this and to keep everything above board, to take care of this so that nothing is lost, so that there's no question. And for Ezra, in this circumstance, there can be no accusation of impropriety against him either, because he has taken all of this and put it in someone else's hands.
Also in verse 29, apparently he had weighed them at the beginning of it. He's going to weigh them when he finishes, so that there is proof that it all happened right.
You're right. Good observation. He's going to, should we call that double indemnity insurance in a manner of speaking? So the journey, verses 31 to 36, is a safe one. They arrive without complication. We departed the river Ahava on the 12th day, first month, to go to Jerusalem. The hand of our God was on us. He delivered us from the hand of the enemy and from ambushes on the way, by the way. Came to Jerusalem, and there we remained 3 days. On the 4th day, within the house of our God, the silver, the gold, the vessels were weighed into the hands of Meremoth, the priest, son of Uriah. With him was Eleazar, the son of Phinehas. With them were the Levites. The whole was counted and weighed. The weight of everything was recorded. So everything was taken care of. God protects them. Verses 31 to 35, everything is done. Those who had come from captivity, the returned exiles, offered burnt offerings to the God of Israel. 12 bulls for all Israel, 96 rams, 77 lambs, as a sin offering, 12 male goats. All this was a burnt offering to the Lord. They also delivered the king's commissions to the king's satraps and the governors of the province beyond the river, and they aided the people in the house of God. So they accomplished what they were sent to do, at least the initial stages of it as far as the king is concerned. At chapter
River referred to here, is that, we know what that is?
Say again?
Where it says beyond the river.
Yes.
Was that the Euphrates? Was that the
That's a good question. What is the river here? Now, from the Babylonian perspective, beyond the river would almost certainly be west of the Euphrates. From the Medo-Persian perspective, that might or might not be the case. You've got the Tigris, you've got the Euphrates, you've got the whole of the Fertile Crescent that they have to traverse, or northern Arabia, the waste spaces there. It's very possible, though, given the way that the provinces were broken up, beyond the river there might even be west side of the Jordan. You think about where Zerubbabel went. Zerubbabel goes to Jerusalem and has charge of the area immediately around Jerusalem. 20 or 30 square miles, maybe. He doesn't have people to populate much more than that. They don't have the wherewithal to control much more than that. And Tattenai, in his day, is governor of the province beyond the river, whatever river that is. That's the area that pertains to Jerusalem and Judea. Could the river in view here be the Jordan? I don't know. Scholars would tend to differ according to their perspective. I have read this through the years, assuming, and it is an assumption on my part, assuming that it was local, because the opposition in Zerubbabel's day was local. The interaction with Tattenai in the days of Haggai and Zechariah seems to have been pretty local to Jerusalem, local to that area. But again, from a Babylonian point of view, and of course we're dealing with the Medo-Persian empire, not the Babylonians at this point, but certainly from a Babylonian point of view, the river would almost certainly be the Euphrates. Just as for the Egyptians, the river would be unquestionably the Nile, even though there are a few other rivers that empty into it. It's a good question. I don't know how big that ancient province would have been. Now, if you think about it, though, the Euphrates is way over here in the region of modern day Iraq.
Yeah.
Jerusalem, Judea, they're way over here. That would make for an enormous piece of territory encompassing a big part of modern Iraq and Arabia and Syria and ancient Assyria, as well as all of what we would consider modern day Palestine or modern day Israel. So that would be one huge province if it's reckoned from the Euphrates River.
Yeah, that's why I was so curious.
Well, given that we read repeatedly about the 127 provinces of the Babylonian and Medo-Persian empires, I would find it unusual, maybe improbable, that one province would dominate so much territory in that empire. That would encompass probably a quarter to a third of the entire territory in one province. And given that would also incorporate scores, if not hundreds, of ancient kingdoms and peoples, it makes me wonder if it could be that much area and not some smaller segment. I'll have to do some reading about that. I hadn't really given that a lot of thought up to this point.
In the Truth for Today commentary, he is, when he mentions that in chapter 7,
right,
he says that was the Jews only that were living in the satrap known as Beyond the River.
Right. Well, that would almost certainly make the river the Jordan in that setting, because they're on the west side of Jordan. I'll have to scratch around on that a little bit. My copy of that has not yet arrived, by the way. I don't know what their delay is, but
Yeah, I thought you might could have bought one like this week,
well,
but I don't know that they had any.
I suppose so, but I did not see one. I looked.
I didn't see that one particular one, but
I did not check every book dealer who was present at Polishing the Pulpit, but
well, they didn't have as many as they usually have.
right. And I did not see a copy of it. I saw several others, but I didn't see that particular. Yeah. It'll get here someday. Surely by the end of the semester, at any rate. Well, as we come to the end of chapter 9, they aided the people in the house of God. They did everything that was authorized. And in chapter 9, and of course, I'm about to get ahead of myself. We've covered this a little quicker, really, than I had anticipated. But in chapter 9, Ezra is going to kind of switch gears now and begin to focus on the other part of his commission from the king. The first order of business in this expedition on his part, or this journey, has been to safely transport all of the wealth that has been gathered up from the king and from his treasury and from the free will offerings and so forth, get that safely to Jerusalem, to the temple, get it accounted for, make sure that our books balance and that nothing's lost. And they've accomplished that. But go back and look at the end of chapter 7 as we look at the decree that's given. What else is Ezra tasked to do? Set up courts, set up more, and I don't want to use the word in a bad sense, but in a practical sense, set up more bureaucracy, more government, more, could we say government services in a sense, than they have had to date up to this point. Appoint magistrates, set judges in place. In other words, at this point, the children of Israel have been, some of them, back in the promised land at least as long as they had been in captivity. And so it is time for them to move beyond just being there and transform this area into an asset and not a drag on the empire. It's time for them to begin to be a benefit to the empire, basically. Now, Zerubbabel had led 50,000 people, arguably maybe 5 times that if we're counting women and children and so forth. But minimum 50,000 people back to Jerusalem, to the ruins of Jerusalem, in 536, 535 BC. Over 60 to 70 years' time, how many should they have multiplied out to? We would think conservatively there ought to be 4 or 5 times that many people, and given that they tended to try to have large families and lots of children, by this point, 2.5 generations later, 2 generations later, they ought to have multiplied 10 times at least, maybe 500,000 people or more. Possibly, if there were many more than that to start with, over 1 million. Well, that many people farming and herding sheep and plying their trades and so forth, there ought to be some commerce back and forth through there. Think about the location that we're talking about right here, basically along the Mediterranean coast, from the Fertile Crescent around down the coast to Egypt, travel back and forth. Solomon had made himself the wealthiest ruler of the ancient world, largely on the basis of trade through his territory. At this point, these people have been there long enough that they ought to be generating income for the empire. This ought to be a positive economic influence in the empire. But what do they need to make that happen? Well, they need the presence of the empire represented. They need courts, they need judges, they need administration of law and so forth. They don't need to just live hand to mouth. And that's part of what Ezra is tasked to do, is to move them forward as a nation. Zerubbabel had reestablished them as a religion in the land. Haggai and Zechariah had solidified that identity and that loyalty to the law of Moses. Now, as we'll see in chapters 9, 10 of Ezra, that loyalty to Moses' law has not been uniformly strong. But Ezra's job at this point is to take them from being a group of people with a common religion in the Medo-Persian Empire to being a client kingdom, as it were, or a client nation in the Medo-Persian Empire. So to do that, they've got to add in the trappings of national identity, which is the civil side of their existence. The interesting, sort of sad aspect of this is that as time goes by, through the intertestamental period, through the time of Greek influence and down to the days of the Roman overlords, what happens to the governmental structure of Judah? Israel, Judah, as a national entity, has always been through the scriptures a theocracy. Their civil law is rooted in the law of God. But what happens from Ezra moving forward historically is that civil law rooted in the law of God, in a sense, begins to overshadow the law of God. Not merely in secular matters, but also in religious matters. What do we see during the succeeding generations of the intertestamental period? We see the rise of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and we see the Pharisees beginning to codify the law of the Lord, and how does it apply in this situation, and this situation, and this situation, and this situation. Write it down, write it down, write it down, write it down. And so we come to the point where Jesus, in his turn, takes the Pharisees and the chief priests to task for elevating the traditions of men over the law of God. All of that, in one sense, traces back to what Ezra is tasked to accomplish here. That's a good place for us to stop, even if it's a few minutes early. We'll pick up in chapter 9 next week, Lord willing. Questions or comments or thoughts or observations or complaints?
No. Going on home tonight?
I beg your pardon?
Going on home tonight?
Well, I suppose I could camp in the back parking lot here at Piedmont Road, but I believe I'll just go on home.
Yeah.
I just have to stop and get fuel on the way. I will see y'all next week, good Lord willing.
Pray. Have a good night.
All right.
Good to see both of you. Look forward to next week.
Okay.